The teacup shattered against the wall, missing Alira's head by inches, and the room went silent except for her mother's ragged breathing. "You embarrass this family every time you open your mouth," Margaret Hart said, her voice shaking with a fury that had been building for years. "Look at your sisters, look at how they carry themselves, and look at you." Alira did not flinch. She had learned long ago that flinching only invited more. She knelt down, gathered the broken pieces of porcelain from the floor with steady hands, and said nothing. Her sister Wren watched from the doorway with a small, satisfied smile, while Delphine examined her own reflection in the hallway mirror, entirely uninterested in the scene behind her. This was an ordinary evening in the Hart household. There had been no real reason for the outburst. A merchant's son had come calling for Wren, and in passing, he had asked who the quiet girl in the kitchen was. That single question had been enough. Margaret could not bear the idea that a stranger might notice Alira before noticing her prized daughters. Alira set the broken pieces on the table and walked out to the garden, where the cold night air met her like an old friend. She sat on the stone bench beneath the crooked apple tree, the same bench where years ago an elderly woman named Ivy used to sit beside her and teach her the names of herbs, the smell of crushed mint, the way lavender could calm a racing heart, the way certain roots could pull a fever down before it turned dangerous. Ivy had been the only person in Alira's life who ever looked at her and saw something worth keeping. "They will not always see you the way they do now," Ivy used to say, working a mortar and pestle with hands more wrinkled than tree bark. "People like your mother and sisters, they measure worth with their eyes, but eyes are lazy things, Alira. They miss almost everything that matters." Ivy had passed 2 winters ago, leaving behind a small wooden box of dried herbs, a stack of handwritten notes on healing, and a girl who had nowhere else to turn for kindness. Alira was 20 years old, though she often felt far older, worn down by a lifetime of comparisons she never asked to be part of. She was not unattractive. She simply did not fit the narrow shape of beauty her mother worshipped. Her nose was a little too strong, her jaw a little too square, her frame a little too tall and a little too thin in the wrong places, according to Margaret's endless commentary. Wren had golden curls and a laugh that turned heads at Margaret. Delphine had the kind of face people compared to painted portraits. Alira had brown hair she kept braided out of practicality, sharp gray eyes that missed very little, and hands that had learned to be useful instead of decorative. In a house where usefulness was never celebrated, only appearance, Alira had built a quiet world of her own. She spent her mornings in the garden behind the house, tending herbs long before the rest of the household woke. She spent her afternoons walking to the edges of Thornfield, gathering plants from the hedgerows and riverbanks, filling small cloth pouches with roots and leaves she had learned to identify by scent alone. And in the evenings, when the rest of the family gathered in the parlor to entertain suitors and gossip about neighbors, Alira sat in the kitchen, grinding, drying, and labeling her small collection of remedies. The villagers of Thornfield had slowly come to know her, not by name at first, but by what she could do. A farmer's son with a burn on his arm, a fisherman's wife with a cough that would not leave her chest through winter, an old widow whose joints ached so badly she could no longer kneel to pray. One by one, they found their way to the Hart family's back door. Not for Margaret, not for Wren, not for Delphine, but for the quiet daughter who never charged more than they could afford, and often charged nothing at all. Margaret hated this most of all. It was not enough that Alira lacked the beauty she demanded. Now the girl had built a small reputation of her own, one that had nothing to do with the family name Margaret had spent her life polishing. Whenever a villager thanked Alira within earshot of her mother, Margaret's jaw would tighten, and later, behind closed doors, Alira would pay for it in sharp words, in comparisons, in reminders of exactly where she stood in her mother's eyes. That night, after the shattered teacup, Alira remained in the garden long after the house had gone dark. She looked up at the sky, at the same stars Ivy used to point out and name, and she allowed herself, just for a moment, to imagine a different life. Not a grand one, not a life of parties and silk gowns like the one her sisters dreamed of, just a life where she was not constantly measured and found lacking. A life where her hands, her mind, her quiet steadiness counted for something in the eyes of the people who were supposed to love her. She did not know, as she sat beneath the crooked apple tree with the cold settling into her shoulders, that her life was about to change in a way no one in that house could have predicted. She did not know that within days, a storm would roll down from the northern hills, that a grand carriage bearing a crest she had never seen would break an axle on the road just outside the village, and that the richest, most talked-about nobleman in the entire region would find himself standing in the mud of Thornfield with nowhere to turn. But to the girl, her own family had spent years trying to erase. For now she only knew the cold stone beneath her, the smell of crushed mint still clinging faintly to her fingers, and the quiet, stubborn part of herself that refused, despite everything, to disappear. She rose before dawn broke over Thornfield, as she always did, moving through the house like a shadow, so as not to wake anyone who might find a reason to complain. The kitchen fire needed lighting. The bread needed kneading before the baker's boy arrived to trade flour for herbs, and her garden, small as it was, needed tending before the sun grew too strong. It was in these early hours, when the house belonged only to her, that Alira allowed herself to feel something close to peace. The birds had not yet been chased off by her sister's loud morning chatter. Her mother's sharp voice had not yet filled the halls with complaints about the weather, the neighbors, or Alira herself. There was only the soft crunch of frost beneath her boots, the smell of turned soil, and the quiet satisfaction of watching green things grow from careful, patient work. She had begun keeping a small notebook, much like the ones Ivy used to fill with careful handwriting. In it, Alira recorded which plants worked best for fevers, which eased pain in aching joints, which could calm a frightened child's stomach. She was not formally trained. No physician in the region would have looked twice at a village girl with no name behind her. But knowledge, she had learned, did not care who carried it, only whether it was used with care. By mid-morning, a line of familiar faces had already begun forming near the back gate, as it often did. Farmer Dobbs, whose knees had grown stiff with age. A young mother whose infant would not stop crying through the night. An older man named Corwin, who had once been the village blacksmith before his hands grew too weak to hold a hammer, now suffering from headaches so severe he could barely open his eyes in daylight. Alira greeted each of them by name, listened patiently to their complaints, and worked through her small stock of remedies with the calm confidence of someone who had spent years earning trust one small victory at a time. She never rushed. She never dismissed anyone's pain as unimportant, no matter how minor it seemed. It was, perhaps, the one place in her life where she felt like she mattered exactly as she was. "You've got a gift, girl," Corwin told her that morning, pressing a few coins into her palm despite her protest that he owed her nothing. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." She smiled, tucking the coins into her apron pocket, though she knew better than to bring such words home. Praise from villagers was one thing. Praise repeated within the walls of the Hart household was another matter entirely, one that always seemed to end badly. The rest of the day passed in its usual rhythm. Wren and Delphine slept late, then spent hours in front of mirrors preparing for an afternoon visit from the merchant's son who had asked about Alira the night before, an irony not lost on her, though she said nothing of it. Margaret fussed over which gown made Wren's eyes look brighter, which ribbon suited Delphine's hair, entirely absorbed in the performance of presenting her daughters to the world. Alira, meanwhile, slipped away to the riverbank with her collecting basket, glad for the excuse to be elsewhere. The autumn air had turned sharp, carrying with it the smell of coming rain, and dark clouds had begun gathering over the hills to the north. She worked quickly, gathering the last of the season's willow bark before the weather turned, her mind occupied with nothing more complicated than the task in front of her. She did not yet know that far beyond those hills, on a road she had never traveled, a convoy of carriages bearing the crest of House Voss was making its way toward the capital, carrying with it a man whose name was spoken across the region with equal parts admiration and unease. Cassian Voss, the wealthiest and most private noble in living memory, a man who had inherited more land and fortune than he had ever asked for, and who was known far more for his absence from society than his presence in it. The clouds Alira watched gathering over the hills would, within a day, become the very storm that changed everything. That evening, as she walked home with her basket full and her boots damp from the riverbank, she passed by the crooked apple tree in the garden and paused, as she often did, to rest her hand against its bark. It had become a small habit, a quiet moment of connection to Ivy, to the only unconditional kindness she had ever known in that house. "Something's coming," she murmured to herself, though she could not have said why the thought crossed her mind, or why a strange, unfamiliar feeling settled over her as she looked toward the darkening northern sky. She dismissed it as nothing more than the weight of the coming storm and went inside, unaware that the feeling had, in fact, been entirely correct. The storm broke just after sunset, exactly as the clouds had promised, and within an hour the road leading into Thornfield had turned into a river of mud and rushing water. Lightning split the sky in jagged white lines, and thunder rolled across the hills like something enormous shifting in its sleep. Most sensible travelers had taken shelter hours earlier, but one convoy of carriages, caught between towns with no inn close enough to reach in time, found itself trapped on the worsening road just outside the village. The lead carriage, its wheels sinking deeper into the mud with every passing minute, belonged to Cash and Voss, though none of the villagers who would soon encounter it had any idea whose crest was painted on its side. All they knew, when the shouting reached the edge of Thornfield, was that something had gone terribly wrong on the northern road. A young stable boy came running through the rain, pounding on doors and shouting for help, saying a grand carriage had broken an axle, and one of the guards had been thrown from his horse when the animal spooked at a crack of lightning. Villagers began emerging cautiously from their homes, peering out at the storm with the wary curiosity of people who rarely saw anything so dramatic happen so close to their doorsteps. Alira had been in the kitchen when the shouting began, wrapping the last of the day's willow bark in cloth to dry. She set the bundle down immediately and reached for the leather satchel she kept prepared for emergencies, filled with bandages, salves, and the herbs most useful for injuries. Her mother, hearing the commotion, appeared in the doorway with irritation written across her face. "Where do you think you're going in this weather?" "Someone is hurt," Alira said simply, already pulling her cloak from its hook. "That is not your concern. Whoever they are, they have their own people to attend to them." But Alira was already moving, and for once, she did not stop to absorb her mother's disapproval. She stepped out into the storm, the rain immediately soaking through her cloak, and followed the sound of frightened voices toward the northern road. What she found there when she arrived was chaos wrapped in mud and rain. Two enormous carriages sat tilted at odd angles, their wheels buried deep. Servants and guards moved frantically around them, shouting instructions that seemed to accomplish very little beyond adding to the noise. In the center of it all, a man lay on the ground, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle, blood soaking through the fabric of his trousers where a jagged branch had struck him as his horse bolted. Villagers had gathered at the edges of the scene, whispering among themselves, too intimidated by the fine clothing and obvious wealth of the travelers to step forward and offer any real help. Fear of embarrassing themselves in front of nobility, Alira would later realize, had frozen an entire crowd of otherwise capable people into uselessness. She pushed through them without hesitation, kneeling beside the injured guard in the mud, entirely unbothered by the rain soaking her hair, the cold water seeping into her boots, or the fine clothing of the people surrounding her. She had treated wounds far messier than this one in far worse conditions. "I need light," she said, her voice carrying with a calm authority that surprised even her. "And something to use as a splint. That branch there will do." For a moment, no one moved, too startled by the sudden appearance of a village girl taking charge of a scene that wealthy servants had been unable to manage. Then a young manservant, perhaps grateful that someone finally had a plan, hurried forward with a lantern. Alira worked quickly, her hands moving with the same steady confidence they always did, cutting away fabric to examine the wound properly, packing it with a pressed herb mixture from her satchel to slow the bleeding, and setting the leg with a firmness that made the injured guard grit his teeth but hold still. She spoke to him the entire time in a low, even voice, the kind of voice that Ivy had once told her mattered almost as much as the medicine itself. "You're going to be all right," she said. "This will hurt for a moment and then it will hurt much less. Breathe with me." It was in the middle of this work, with rain streaming down her face and mud staining her sleeves to the elbow, that she became aware of someone watching her closely from just beyond the lantern light. She glanced up briefly and saw a tall man standing near the tilted carriage, his fine coat soaked through, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, watching her with an intensity that felt entirely different from the nervous curiosity of the crowd behind her. She did not know in that moment that she was looking at Cassian Voss himself. She only registered briefly that his eyes did not carry the polite dismissal she was used to receiving from people of higher standing. If anything, they carried something closer to disbelief, as though he had expected chaos and confusion and instead found competence where he least anticipated it. She returned her attention to the guard, finishing the splint, wrapping it firmly, and instructing two of the nearby servants on how to lift him without worsening the injury. Only once the man had been carried carefully into the second carriage, out of the worst of the rain, did she allow herself to straighten up and take a full breath. That was when the tall man approached her directly, stepping through the mud without any apparent concern for his fine boots. "You knew exactly what to do," he said, his voice low but clear even over the sound of the storm. "Where did you learn that?" Elira, still catching her breath, wiped rain from her eyes and studied him properly for the first time. He was not what she expected of wealth, not that she had much experience to compare him to. There was no arrogance in his posture, no impatience in his expression, only a kind of quiet, focused attention that made her feel, oddly, as though she were the only person on that muddy road worth looking at. "An old woman taught me," she answered honestly. "She's gone now, but I kept what she gave me." "You saved that man's leg, possibly his life if the bleeding had continued the way it was going." "I did what needed doing," Elira said simply, uncomfortable with praise she had rarely received and did not quite know how to hold. "He'll need proper rest and someone to change that dressing daily. The wound could still turn if it's neglected." The man studied her for a long moment, rain running down both their faces, the storm still raging around them with no sign of easing. "And who," he asked slowly, "taught the daughter of this village to speak with such certainty?" "No one taught me to speak that way," she said. "I simply stopped waiting for permission to." Something shifted in his expression then, something she could not fully name, though it stayed with her long after that night had ended. He did not laugh, as many of the finely dressed people around them might have expected of someone with power addressing someone without it. He did not look away in polite dismissal, the way her own family so often did. He simply held her gaze, as though genuinely trying to understand what he was looking at. "I am in your debt," he said finally. "That is not something I say lightly, and it is not something I intend to forget." Before Elira could respond, one of his attendants approached with urgent news about the broken axle, pulling his attention away, and Elira, suddenly aware of how far she had strayed from the safety of anonymity, gathered her satchel and slipped back through the crowd toward home, leaving the strange, intense stranger behind her in the rain. She did not learn his name that night. She did not think, as she trudged home soaked and shivering, that she would ever see him again. Nobles who broke down near small villages rarely returned to them once their carriages were repaired and their journeys resumed. But 3 days later, a rider bearing the crest of House Voss arrived at the edge of Thornfield, asking specifically for the household of a family with a daughter skilled in herbal medicine. And Elira's ordinary life ended quietly, without fanfare, the moment that rider knocked on her family's front door. Margaret answered the door herself, and when she saw the fine crest on the rider's coat, her entire posture changed, straightening with sudden, eager attention. She assumed, immediately and without hesitation, that whatever business had brought a noble's messenger to her doorstep must surely concern one of her beautiful daughters. "We are honored," she said, already gesturing for Wren and Delphine to come forward, arranging them like porcelain figures on a shelf. Please come in out of the cold." The rider, a young man with careful manners, stepped inside but did not sit, and did not so much as glance twice at either Wren or Delphine, both of whom had arranged themselves in their most flattering poses near the fireplace. "I bring a message from Lord Cashin Voss," he said, "for the young woman who treated his injured guard 3 nights past on the northern road." The room fell into confused silence. Margit's smile faltered, uncertain, as her eyes moved between her daughters, none of whom had left the house that stormy night, and finally landed with visible reluctance on Elira, who stood quietly near the kitchen doorway, still holding a bundle of drying herbs in her hands. "That would be my daughter," Margit said slowly, the words clearly costing her something to speak aloud. The rider turned toward Elira and offered a formal bow, the kind of gesture no one in that household had ever directed toward her before. "Lord Voss requests the honor of calling upon your family to properly express his gratitude for the service rendered to his household." Elira felt every eye in the room turn toward her, her mother's confusion, her sister's disbelief, and beneath it all, a small, unfamiliar flicker of something she barely recognized as pride. The days leading up to Lord Voss's visit passed in a strange, unfamiliar blur for the Hart household, one filled with a kind of frantic energy Elira had never experienced from the inside before, only ever witnessed as an outsider peering in. Margit threw herself into preparations with an intensity that bordered on desperation. The good silverware was polished until it gleamed. The parlor curtains, faded from years of sun, were replaced with fabric Margit could not entirely afford but purchased anyway, insisting the family's reputation depended on it. Wren and Delphine spent hours discussing which gowns might catch the eye of a man as wealthy and reclusive as Cashin Voss, each one privately convinced that his visit, whatever its stated purpose, was truly an opportunity for one of them. No one asked Elira how she felt about any of it. No one considered that perhaps the visit had nothing to do with either of her sisters at all. In their minds, a man of Voss's standing could not possibly be calling upon a household to honor its least remarkable daughter. Surely, they reasoned among themselves in whispered conversations Elira was clearly meant to overhear. He simply intended to use the occasion of thanking Elira as an excuse to properly meet the family's true prizes. Elira said nothing to correct them. She had learned over many years that arguing against her family's assumptions rarely accomplished anything beyond exhausting herself. Instead, she continued her usual routine, tending her garden, seeing to the villagers who still arrived at the back gate each morning, and trying, without much success, to ignore the strange, persistent flutter of nervousness that settled in her chest whenever she thought about the tall, quiet man from the storm. She had turned his words over in her mind more times than she cared to admit. "I am in your debt." That is not something I say lightly. There had been something in the way he looked at her, something that felt entirely unlike the careless glances she was used to receiving, that she could not quite explain away as simple gratitude for medical help. On the morning of the visit, the household transformed itself into something Elira barely recognized. Fresh flowers had been arranged in every room. The best tea service had been retrieved from storage. Margit moved through the house issuing instructions in a voice tight with nervous excitement, arranging and rearranging her daughters near the window where the afternoon light would fall most flatteringly across their faces. "Elira," her mother said finally, turning to her with an expression that made it clear the instruction was more command than request, "you will greet him properly, thank him for his kindness in visiting, and then allow your sisters to entertain him. There is no need for you to linger. I'm sure he has more interesting company to occupy his time." Elira nodded, though something in her chest tightened at the casual cruelty of the request, delivered as though it were simply common sense rather than yet another small erasure. She had grown so used to disappearing on command that the instruction barely surprised her anymore, though it still stung in the quiet way old wounds always did. When the carriage arrived, its wheels crunching over the gravel path leading to their modest front door, the entire household gathered in the entryway with a kind of collective held breath. Margit smoothed her skirts one final time. Wren adjusted a curl that had fallen slightly out of place. Delphine practiced a smile in the hallway mirror. Cashin Voss stepped down from his carriage dressed far more simply than his title might have suggested, in dark, well-tailored clothing that spoke of quality without ostentation. He moved with the same quiet, controlled presence Alira remembered from the storm, though without the rain and mud, she could now see him clearly for the first time. He was perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair, a serious face that seemed unused to smiling easily, and eyes that missed very little as they swept briefly across the assembled family before settling, with unmistakable intent, on Alira herself. "Lord Voss," Margit said, dropping into a deep, practiced curtsy the moment he entered. "We are deeply honored by your visit. Please come in." He returned the greeting with polite formality, allowing himself to be led into the parlor, where Margit had arranged an elaborate spread of refreshments far beyond what the family could reasonably afford. Wren and Delphine positioned themselves gracefully on either side of the room, waiting for the conversation to naturally turn toward them, as it always did with visitors of note. But Cashin did not sit where Margit gestured. Instead, he turned first to Alira, who had positioned herself near the back of the room exactly as instructed, and addressed her directly, as though the rest of the family were simply not present. "Miss Hart," he said, using her surname with a formality that somehow felt more respectful than familiar. "I trust the guard I sent word about has been recovering well. I understand you provided instructions for his continued care." Alira blinked, momentarily thrown by the direct question after days of being told to expect nothing more than a passing thank you before fading into the background. "I did," she said carefully, "though I have no way of knowing if the dressing has been changed properly or if the wound has begun healing as it should." "It has," Cashin said, "precisely as you described. My physician was, I confess, somewhat put out to learn that a village apothecary's method succeeded where his own initial assessment had been far less optimistic." A ripple of confusion passed visibly across Margit's face, her carefully constructed smile faltering as she processed the fact that Cashin's attention remained fixed entirely on the daughter she had spent years dismissing. Wren shifted uncomfortably near the window, no longer bothering to maintain her flattering pose. Delphine's expression had shifted from polite anticipation to something closer to irritation. "Please, Lord Voss," Margit interjected, attempting to redirect the conversation with the practiced charm she usually reserved for exactly this purpose. "You must be exhausted from your journey. Do sit and allow my daughters to properly welcome you. Wren has just returned from visiting relatives in the capital and has the most fascinating stories to share." Cashin offered Margit a polite but brief nod, the kind of acknowledgement that closed a conversation rather than opened one, and turned back toward Alira. "I understand you learned your skills from someone in this household." "My grandmother's friend," Alira said quietly, choosing not to correct the assumption entirely, though Ivy had been no blood relation at all, simply the only person who had ever chosen to love her without condition. "She taught me a great deal before she passed." "And your family," Cashin said, his gaze flickering briefly, almost imperceptibly, toward Margit before returning to Alira, "has encouraged this skill." The question hung in the air with a weight that made Margit's smile tighten visibly. Alira hesitated, unsure how honest to be in front of a stranger of such standing, unsure whether admitting the truth might somehow embarrass her family in a way that would follow her long after this visit ended. "I've been permitted to practice it," she said finally, choosing her words with the same careful diplomacy she used when treating a patient with a difficult diagnosis, softening the truth without abandoning it entirely. Something in Cashin's expression suggested he understood exactly what she had left unsaid, though he did not press the matter further. Not directly, not in front of the family who had clearly hoped this visit would center on anyone but the daughter now holding his full attention. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Margit making repeated, increasingly transparent attempts to steer the discussion toward Wren's accomplishments or Delphine's admired grace. Each attempt met with polite but firm redirection from Cashin, whose questions consistently returned to Alira, to her knowledge of herbs, to the villagers she treated, to the notebook she kept filled with careful observations about which remedies worked and which did not. By the time he rose to leave, the atmosphere in the room had shifted into something tense and uncomfortable, though only Alira, and she suspected, Cashin himself seemed to fully understand why. Margit's carefully constructed afternoon had unraveled in a way she clearly had not anticipated, and did not know how to address without appearing openly resentful in front of a man whose favor she desperately wanted to secure, if not for Alira, then eventually for one of her other daughters. At the door, as his carriage waited outside, Cashin turned back once more, addressing the room generally, but his eyes finding Alira's with unmistakable intent. "I find myself in need of assistance," he said, "cataloging a collection of medical and botanical texts recently acquired for my estate's library. Many are old, some poorly preserved, and I lack the expertise to properly organize them. Miss Hart's knowledge would be invaluable to the task." The silence that followed was thick enough to taste. Margit's mouth opened slightly, though no words emerged. Wren stared openly, no longer bothering to mask her disbelief. Delphine's jaw had tightened into a hard, unhappy line. "I would consider it a great favor," Cashin continued, addressing Alira directly now, ignoring the rest of the room entirely, "if you would consent to visit Ashcombe Hall and assist with this work. I would, of course, ensure your family is properly compensated for the loan of your time and expertise." Alira felt every eye in the room settle on her, waiting, watching, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, the attention did not feel like judgment. It felt, strangely, almost like possibility. "I would need to discuss it with my mother," she said carefully, glancing briefly at Margit, whose expression had settled into something unreadable, somewhere between fury and calculation. "Of course," Cashin said, offering a slight formal bow. "I will send word in 3 days for your answer." He left as quietly and purposefully as he had arrived, his carriage disappearing down the gravel path while the Hart household remained frozen in stunned, uncomfortable silence behind him. It was Margit who spoke first, once the sound of the carriage had faded entirely. "Well," she said, her voice tight and controlled in the particular way that always preceded something far less controlled, "it seems Lord Voss has taken an unusual interest in cataloging books." Wren let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "He barely looked at either of us the entire visit." "There must be some mistake," Delphine said, crossing her arms tightly. "Men like that do not call upon households to speak with the plain daughter about herbs." Alira said nothing, standing quietly in the doorway where she had spent the entire visit, absorbing words that, for once, had not been designed to diminish her. She did not yet know what to make of the strange offer, or the strange man who had made it, or the strange, unfamiliar warmth that had settled somewhere beneath her ribs the moment he had spoken her name as though it mattered. She only knew that for the first time in her life, someone outside the walls of her small, careful world had looked directly at her and seen something worth pursuing, and that knowledge, however small, however uncertain, felt like the first crack of light through a door she had long ago stopped believing might ever open. The 3 days between Cashin's visit and his promised return passed slowly, thick with a tension that had settled over the Hart household like fog that refused to lift. Margit said little directly to Alira, though her silence carried its own particular weight, heavier and colder than any of her usual sharp words. Wren and Delphine whispered in corners, their conversations trailing off whenever Alira entered a room, as though her presence alone might somehow confirm whatever unflattering theories they had constructed about why a nobleman would take interest in her. Alira spent those days as she always had, tending her garden, treating the villagers who arrived at her gate each morning, and trying, without much success, to quiet the persistent uncertainty churning inside her. Part of her wanted desperately to believe that Cashin's offer was exactly what it appeared to be, an opportunity built on genuine respect for her knowledge. Another part of her, shaped by years of learning to expect disappointment, kept searching for the catch, the hidden cruelty, The moment when this small, unexpected kindness would reveal itself as something else entirely. "You're distracted," Corwin observed on the second morning, watching her measure out a tincture with less precision than usual. "Something on your mind, girl." Alira hesitated, unsure how much to share, though Corwin had always been kind to her, kinder in many ways than her own family. "A nobleman has asked for my help with something," she admitted finally. "I don't know if I should agree." Corwin studied her for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful. "Why wouldn't you?" "Because people like that don't usually want anything from people like me," she said quietly, "except perhaps to use me for something and discard me after." "Some might," Corwin agreed. "But you've spent your whole life being told you're not worth noticing, and now someone's noticed you. Seems to me the question isn't whether you should trust him yet. It's whether you're going to let fear decide for you before you even find out." His words stayed with her long after he left, turning over in her mind as she finished her morning work and made her way back toward the house, where her mother waited with an expression that had grown increasingly difficult to read. On the third day, as promised, the writer from Ashcombe Hall returned, this time bearing a formal written invitation rather than a verbal message. Margaret took the letter first, as she insisted on doing with all correspondence entering her household, and read it silently before handing it to Alira with visible reluctance. The letter was written in a firm, careful hand, formal in its language but somehow warmer than Alira expected. Lord Voss requested the pleasure of her assistance at Ashcombe Hall for a period of several weeks, during which time she would be housed comfortably within the estate itself, provided with appropriate compensation, and permitted to return home at any point she wished, should the arrangement prove unsuitable. "You cannot possibly consider this," Margaret said the moment Alira finished reading, her voice sharp with barely contained frustration. "A young, unmarried woman, living unaccompanied in the household of a nobleman. Do you have any idea what people will say?" "They'll say plenty regardless of what I do," Alira replied evenly. "They always have." "This is different," Margaret pressed. "Your reputation, whatever little of it exists, will be entirely ruined. No respectable man will consider you afterward." Alira nearly laughed at the absurdity of the concern, given how thoroughly her mother had spent years ensuring no respectable man ever considered her in the first place, parading her sisters forward at every opportunity while pushing Alira firmly into the background. But she held her tongue, choosing instead to focus on the letter in her hands, on the careful, deliberate wording that suggested a man who had genuinely thought through every possible objection before sending it. "He's arranged for a chaperone," Alira pointed out, gesturing to the relevant line in the letter. "An older woman, a member of his household staff, will be present throughout my stay. Everything will be properly conducted." Margaret's mouth tightened, clearly searching for another argument and finding none readily available. It was Wren, surprisingly, who spoke next, her voice carrying an edge Alira rarely heard directed at her, sharp with something that sounded uncomfortably close to jealousy. "Why would he go to such trouble for you?" Wren asked, not unkindly exactly, but with genuine bewilderment. "It doesn't make sense." "I don't know," Alira admitted honestly, "but I intend to find out." The decision, once made, settled over her with a strange mixture of fear and something that felt almost like hope, an emotion she had learned long ago to guard against, having been disappointed by it too many times before. She spent that evening packing a small bag, careful to include her notebook, her collection of dried herbs, and the few personal items she owned that actually meant something to her. A small wooden comb that had belonged to Ivy, a pressed flower from the garden they had tended together. Margaret did not speak to her again that night, her disapproval settling into a heavy, familiar silence that Alira had long ago learned to move through without letting it crush her entirely. Delphine avoided her gaze whenever their paths crossed. Only Wren lingered near her doorway briefly before bed, hesitating as though she wanted to say something before ultimately turning away without a word. The morning of her departure arrived crisp and clear, the storm that had first brought her into Cashin's world long since past, replaced by pale autumn sunlight that felt, to Alira, almost symbolic of the uncertain new chapter stretching out ahead of her. A modest carriage, far less grand than the one that had broken down on the northern road weeks earlier, arrived to collect her, sent specifically, the driver explained, because Lord Voss had thought a smaller, less conspicuous vehicle might draw less attention to her departure from the village. It was a small consideration, but it struck Alira deeply nonetheless, this quiet evidence that someone had thought carefully about her comfort, her reputation, her feelings, in a way her own family so rarely had. As the carriage pulled away from the only home she had ever known, Alira allowed herself one final glance back at the house, at the crooked apple tree visible above the garden wall, at the window of the kitchen where she had spent countless early mornings finding peace before the household woke. She did not know, watching it all fade slowly into the distance, whether she was leaving behind a life of quiet endurance for something better, or simply trading one uncertainty for another. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was choosing the uncertainty herself, rather than having it forced upon her, and that distinction, small as it seemed, felt like the beginning of something she had never quite dared to imagine before. The journey to Ashcombe Hall took the better part of a day, winding through countryside Alira had never seen, past rolling hills dotted with grazing sheep, through small villages that made Thornfield look modest by comparison, and finally along a long, tree-lined drive that opened suddenly onto the estate itself. Ashcombe Hall rose before her like something from a story ivy might have told, its gray stone walls softened by ivy climbing toward tall windows that caught the afternoon light, its grounds stretching in every direction with gardens far more elaborate than anything Alira had ever tended. She stepped down from the carriage with her small bag clutched tightly in one hand, suddenly, acutely aware of how out of place she must look against such grandeur, her plain traveling dress a stark contrast to the polished elegance surrounding her. An older woman with kind eyes and silver hair pulled into a neat bun approached to greet her, introducing herself as Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper who would also serve as her chaperone during her stay. Her manner was warm but efficient, immediately putting Alira somewhat at ease as she led her through the entrance hall toward the room prepared for her. "Lord Voss has asked that you be made comfortable," Mrs. Winters explained, "and that you have full access to the library whenever you wish, though he mentioned you might prefer to begin the work tomorrow, once you've had time to settle in." Alira nodded, still absorbing the sheer scale of her surroundings, the polished floors, the tall ceilings, the quiet, unhurried elegance of a household that had never known scarcity of any kind. It was, in every visible way, a world entirely foreign to the one she had left behind that morning, and yet walking through it, she felt none of the shrinking discomfort she expected. Perhaps, she thought, because for the first time, no one here seemed to be looking at her expecting to find something lacking. She did not see Cashin that first evening, occupied as he apparently was with matters of estate business, and she found herself both relieved, and to her own quiet surprise, faintly disappointed by his absence. She dined alone in the room prepared for her, a simple but generous meal brought by a young maid who seemed genuinely curious about the village girl who had captured her employer's attention enough to be invited to stay. That night, lying in a bed far softer than any she had ever known, Alira stared up at an unfamiliar ceiling and allowed herself, cautiously, to wonder what the coming weeks might hold. She thought of her mother's warnings, of Wren's confused jealousy, of Corwin's simple, steadying advice not to let fear decide things before she had the chance to find out for herself. Whatever waited for her at Ashcombe Hall, she decided, drifting slowly toward sleep, she intended to meet it with open eyes rather than the guarded caution that had shaped so much of her life until now. She had spent 20 years being told who she was by people who had never truly looked at her. Perhaps here, surrounded by strangers rather than family, she might finally have the chance to discover that answer for herself. Morning at Ashcombe Hall arrived quietly, without the sharp voices and slamming doors Alira had grown so accustomed to waking to at home. She lay still for a moment, momentarily confused by the unfamiliar softness of the bed beneath her, before memory settled in and she remembered exactly where she was and why. A soft knock at her door announced the arrival of the same young maid from the previous evening, carrying a tray of tea and a message that Lord Voss would be pleased to receive her in the library whenever she was ready. Alira dressed quickly in her simplest, most practical dress, tied her hair back the way she always did for work, and made her way downstairs, following the maid's directions through a maze of hallways that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The library, when she finally reached it, stole the breath from her lungs entirely. Towering shelves rose from floor to ceiling, filled with more books than she had ever seen gathered in one place, their spines a patchwork of leather in every shade of brown and green and deep red. Tall windows let in soft morning light that fell across long wooden tables, one of which was already stacked high with old, worn volumes clearly pulled from storage. Cashin stood near the largest of these tables, dressed simply again, his dark hair slightly less controlled than it had been during his formal visit to her family's home, as though he had been running his hands through it while working. He looked up as she entered, and something in his expression shifted, easing into what might, in a less guarded man, have been called relief. "Miss Hart," he said, setting down the book he had been examining, "I trust you slept well." "Better than expected," she admitted honestly. "Your home is beautiful." "It belonged to my father and his father before him," Cashin said, gesturing for her to join him at the table. "I confess I've never found much time to properly appreciate it. Business tends to occupy most of my attention." Alira approached the table and looked over the collection of texts spread across it, recognizing several as botanical and medical references, some clearly quite old, their pages fragile and yellowed with age. "Where did these come from?" "My father collected them over many years, though he was more interested in owning rare books than reading them," Cashin explained. "When he passed, I inherited the collection along with everything else, and it has sat largely untouched since. I recently discovered that several volumes contain information no longer available anywhere else, knowledge that predates much of what modern physicians rely on. I thought it a shame to let such information simply decay in storage." "And you thought of me," Alira said, unable to keep a note of genuine curiosity from her voice. "I thought of no one else capable of the task," Cashin corrected gently. "My own physician has neither the time nor, frankly, the humility to properly value knowledge that predates his training. You, I suspect, will approach these texts rather differently." They began working together that morning, Cashin pulling volumes from shelves while Alira examined each one carefully, cataloging its contents, noting which remedies aligned with what she already knew, and which introduced entirely new methods she had never encountered. It was slow, careful work, the kind that required patience and precision, qualities Alira possessed in abundance after years of practicing medicine with limited resources and no formal guidance. What surprised her most, as the days passed, was not the beauty of the library or the luxury of the estate, but the way Cashin himself engaged with the work. He asked genuine questions, listened carefully to her answers, and never once made her feel as though her opinions mattered less because of where she had come from. When she corrected an assumption he had made about a particular herb's properties, he did not bristle with wounded pride, as she half expected of a man used to deference. Instead, he simply nodded, adjusted his understanding, and thanked her for the correction. "You do that often," he observed one afternoon, several days into her stay, as they worked side by side sorting a particularly disorganized stack of texts. "Diminish yourself before anyone else has the chance to." Alira looked up, startled by the directness of the observation. "I don't know what you mean." "You just corrected an error in my understanding of foxglove's proper dosage, an error that could genuinely harm someone if left uncorrected, and yet you apologized twice before finishing the sentence," Cashin said, his tone gentle rather than accusatory. "You do this frequently. Soften true statements as though they might be unwelcome. Apologize for knowledge that has likely saved lives." Alira felt heat rise in her cheeks, unused to being observed so closely, unused to anyone noticing the small habits she had built over years of learning to make herself smaller, less threatening, less likely to invite the sharp criticism that had followed any display of confidence in her mother's household. "I suppose I'm not accustomed to being listened to," she admitted quietly. "In my experience, confidence rarely earns anything but resentment." Something in Cashin's expression darkened briefly, though not directed at her. "Your mother," he said, not quite a question. Alira hesitated, unsure how much to reveal, though something about the quiet privacy of the library, the steady patience in his manner, made honesty feel safer than it usually did. "My mother has spent my entire life comparing me to my sisters and finding me lacking," she said finally. "It is not something I am accustomed to discussing." "You are not lacking," Cashin said, his voice carrying a firmness that surprised her with its intensity. "In the weeks since I first watched you set a broken leg in the middle of a storm with nothing but a lantern and steady hands, I have come to believe you are one of the most capable people I have ever encountered, noble or otherwise. Your family's failure to recognize that reflects entirely on them, and not at all on you." Alira did not know how to respond to such directness, unused to receiving compliments that were not immediately followed by some qualifying criticism. She busied herself with the book in front of her, blinking rapidly against the unexpected sting of emotion gathering behind her eyes, unwilling to let him see how deeply his words had landed. Over the following weeks, their working relationship deepened into something Alira struggled to name, something that existed comfortably in the space between friendship and a growing, cautious affection neither of them acknowledged directly. They fell into a natural rhythm, mornings spent cataloging the library's collection, afternoons occasionally interrupted by Cashin's estate business, evenings sometimes spent walking through the gardens as the light faded, discussing everything from herbal remedies to the histories contained in the old texts they uncovered together. Alira found herself, for the first time in her life, genuinely relaxing in someone's presence, allowing her guard to lower incrementally with each passing day. Cashin asked about her work with the villagers of Thornfield with real interest, remembering details from previous conversations, following up on patients she had mentioned days earlier as though their well-being genuinely mattered to him. "You remembered Corwin's headaches," she observed one evening, surprised, as they walked along a garden path bordered by late-blooming roses. "I remember most things you tell me," Cashin said simply, as though this were the most natural fact in the world rather than something remarkable to Alira, who had spent her entire life feeling as though nothing she said carried enough weight to remember. Word of her presence at Ashcombe Hall had, inevitably, begun spreading through the noble circles that occupied themselves with such gossip, and Alira became increasingly aware, during the rare occasions Cashin entertained visitors, of curious, assessing glances directed her way. She overheard, more than once, whispered speculation about who exactly the quiet young woman staying at the estate might be, and why Lord Voss, famously private and disinterested in society's usual matchmaking games, had taken such evident interest in her company. She tried not to let the whispers unsettle her, though they inevitably stirred old, familiar insecurities, the same voice that had followed her through years in her mother's household, insisting she did not belong in rooms filled with people more beautiful, more polished, more naturally suited to elegant company than she could ever hope to be. Mrs. Winters, who had grown genuinely fond of Alira over the weeks of her stay, noticed her discomfort during one such gathering and drew her aside with quiet kindness. "Pay them no mind," the older woman advised. "I've served this household for 30 years, and I've never once seen Lord Voss look at anyone the way he looks at you. Whatever they whisper, dear, they're only jealous of something they don't understand." Alira did not fully believe her, not yet, though the words offered a small measure of comfort nonetheless. She had spent too many years learning to expect disappointment to trust easily in something as fragile and unfamiliar as genuine regard, especially from a man whose world remained, in so many practical ways, entirely separate from her own. But as the weeks passed and her scheduled departure date drew closer, Alira found herself dreading the return to Thornfield with an intensity that surprised her, not because she had grown accustomed to luxury, though the comfort of Ashcombe Hall was undeniable, but because she had grown accustomed, for the first time in her life, to being seen clearly, valued honestly, and treated as though her presence in a room added something worth having, rather than something to be quietly managed and minimized. She did not yet know that her family, informed through village gossip of the growing attention surrounding her stay at the estate, had begun their own quiet, calculating preparations, unwilling to accept that the daughter they had spent years dismissing might now be standing at the center of something they desperately wanted for themselves. The letter arrived at Ashcombe Hall on a gray morning nearly 2 months into Alira's stay, carried by a rider who had traveled from Thornfield specifically to deliver it into her hands. Alira recognized her mother's careful, formal handwriting immediately, and something cold settled in her stomach even before she broke the seal, some instinct honed over years warning her that whatever waited inside would not bring good news. The letter itself was brief, filled with an unusual, unfamiliar warmth that Alira read 3 times before she fully trusted it was real. Margaret wrote of missing her daughter, of the family wishing to properly celebrate her good fortune, of an invitation extended for the entire Hart family to attend an upcoming gathering at Ashcombe Hall. One Cashin had apparently organized to introduce Alira formally to several other noble families in the region. Alira brought the letter to Cashin that afternoon, uncertain what to make of her mother's sudden change in tone. "She's never written to me like this before," she admitted, watching his expression carefully as he read it. "I don't know whether to feel hopeful or wary." Cashin's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as he finished reading, though he handed the letter back with careful neutrality. "You know your family better than I do," he said. "Trust your instincts." Her instincts, as it turned out, had been entirely correct. The gathering, when it arrived 2 weeks later, brought together a wider circle of noble families than Alira had yet encountered during her stay. The grand hall filled with silk gowns, polished conversation, and the particular kind of careful social maneuvering she had observed but never fully participated in before. Cashin had arranged the evening specifically to introduce Alira as a person of genuine value within his household, someone whose knowledge and character deserved recognition among the very circles that had previously only whispered about her from a curious distance. Margaret, Wren, and Delphine arrived dressed in their finest, and for a brief, cautious moment, Alira allowed herself to hope that perhaps something had genuinely shifted, that perhaps her family had finally begun to see her differently now that others clearly did. That hope did not survive the evening. It began subtly, the way cruelty in her family always did. Small comments dropped into conversations at moments calculated to cause maximum damage while maintaining plausible deniability. Margaret, speaking to a cluster of noblewomen near the refreshment table, mentioned with practiced casualness that Alira had always been the quiet, awkward one growing up, that the family had worried for years she might never find her place in proper society, that it was a relief, truly, to see Lord Voss taking such patient interest in someone who needed so much guidance. Delphine, meanwhile, engaged a group of young noblemen in conversation, laughing lightly as she described Alira's childhood habit of preferring garden work to social gatherings, framing it in a way that made her sister sound peculiar, unrefined, entirely unsuited to the elegant world she now found herself temporarily occupying. Wren's contribution was, perhaps, the most calculated of all. She approached Alira directly, midway through the evening, with an expression of practiced concern that fooled no one who knew her well, though the surrounding nobles had no such context to draw upon. "You must be exhausted," Wren said, loud enough for several nearby guests to overhear. "Pretending to belong somewhere like this night after night, it must be such a strain, dear sister. No one would blame you for retreating home, back to where things are simpler." The words landed exactly as intended, sharp enough to sting, subtle enough to appear like sisterly concern to anyone unfamiliar with the years of careful cruelty behind them. Alira felt heat rise in her face, old, familiar shame threatening to overwhelm the fragile confidence she had spent months carefully building at Ashcombe Hall. Rumors, she soon realized, had been spreading through the gathering all evening, whispered carefully between guests who had clearly been primed by conversations with her own family members. That Alira had manipulated her way into Lord Voss's favor through calculated helplessness. That her medical knowledge was exaggerated, perhaps even dangerous, learned from an unreliable source with no proper training. That she had no genuine place among people of standing, and that Lord Voss, known for his generous, occasionally naive kindness toward those less fortunate, had simply been taken in by a clever village girl seeking to improve her circumstances through deception. By the time the evening reached its midpoint, Alira found herself standing alone near a tall window, having quietly excused herself from a conversation that had grown too pointed to bear gracefully, her carefully maintained composure cracking under the weight of whispers she could hear but not directly confront without appearing exactly as unrefined as her family had suggested she was. It was there that Cashin found her, having noticed her absence from the main gathering, and excused himself from his own conversation to seek her out. "You've disappeared," he said gently, approaching with the careful attentiveness that had become so familiar over the past months. "I needed air," Alira admitted, unable to fully mask the tightness in her voice. Cashin studied her closely, his expression sharpening with concern. "What happened?" She hesitated, reluctant to burden him with the ugly undercurrent running beneath the evening's polished surface, unwilling to confirm, even to herself, how deeply her family's whispered cruelty had managed to wound her despite months of growing confidence. "Nothing worth discussing," she said finally, attempting a smile that did not fully reach her eyes. But Cashin, whose attention to her had never been careless, was not so easily deflected. He had spent the evening moving through his own conversations, and had, in fact, already caught fragments of the same rumors circulating through the gathering, whispered speculation about manipulation and calculated helplessness that struck him as deeply, obviously wrong given everything he had personally witnessed of Alira's character over the past 2 months. "I've heard what's being said," he told her quietly, "and I know precisely where it originated." Alira looked up, startled by the certainty in his voice. "Cashin, your mother has spent the better part of this evening ensuring every guest present understands you as someone incapable, someone manipulative, someone fundamentally unsuited to the respect I have shown you," he continued, his voice low but carrying an intensity Alira had not yet witnessed from him. "Your sisters have contributed their own versions of the same story. I have watched it happen, piece by piece, throughout the evening, and I confess I did not fully understand the depth of what you have endured within your own family until tonight." Shame flooded through her, hot and immediate, the same shame that had followed her through years of similar humiliations, though this time compounded by the mortification of Cashin witnessing it firsthand, of the careful reputation she had built at Ashcombe Hall potentially crumbling under the weight of her own family's calculated cruelty. "I should have warned you," she said quietly. "I should have known they would find some way too." "You have nothing to apologize for," Cashin interrupted firmly. "None of this reflects on you. It reflects entirely on people who have spent years unable, or unwilling, to see what stood plainly in front of them." Before Alira could respond, raised voices from the main hall drew their attention, and they returned together to find the gathering's atmosphere shifted into something tense and uncertain. Margit, apparently emboldened by the evening's success in undermining Alira's standing, had approached a particularly influential noblewoman with a suggestion that perhaps Wren, given her natural grace and proper upbringing, might be a far more suitable companion for someone of Lord Voss's standing than her admittedly peculiar younger sister. The comment, unfortunately for Margit, had been made just loudly enough, and just poorly timed enough, for Cashin himself to overhear as he entered the room with Alira at his side. The hall fell into an uncomfortable, expectant silence as every guest present turned to witness whatever would happen next, sensing, with the particular instinct of people accustomed to social drama, that something significant was about to unfold. Cashin crossed the hall with slow, deliberate steps, and the crowd parted instinctively before him, sensing the shift in his usually controlled demeanor. When he finally spoke, His voice carried clearly across the silent room, calm but edged with something unmistakably firm. "Mrs. Hart," he said, addressing Margaret directly, "I believe I misheard you. Would you care to repeat what you just suggested?" Margaret's face drained of color, her composure cracking visibly under the weight of his attention, so different now from the polite formality he had shown her weeks earlier. "I only meant, Lord Voss, that Wren has always been the more socially accomplished of my daughters, better suited perhaps to the demands of—" "I did not ask for a clarification of your meaning," Cashin interrupted, his tone remaining even despite its clear firmness. "I asked you to repeat what you said, in front of the same guests who heard it the first time." The silence stretched, uncomfortable and absolute, until Margaret, cornered and visibly humiliated, managed only a strangled apology that satisfied no one, least of all Cashin, who turned his attention to address the wider gathering. "I have spent this evening listening to rumors regarding Miss Alira Hart's character," he said, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the hall. "Rumors that suggest manipulation, calculated helplessness, and unsuitability for the company gathered here tonight. I would like to address these directly, since it appears whispered speculation has been allowed to travel further than the truth." He paused, his gaze sweeping deliberately across the assembled guests before settling briefly on Margaret, then on Wren and Delphine, who had gone very still near the edge of the room. "I have known Miss Hart for 2 months," he continued. "In that time I have watched her save a man's leg, possibly his life, in the middle of a violent storm, using nothing but knowledge she taught herself and steady hands she has clearly possessed since long before I ever met her. I have watched her catalog a library's worth of medical knowledge with a precision and dedication that has taught my own physician things he was previously unaware of. I have watched her treat every member of my household, from the stable boy to the head housekeeper, with the same quiet respect and kindness, regardless of their standing." Alira stood frozen near the edge of the hall, her heart pounding, unable to fully process the fact that Cashin was defending her, publicly, without hesitation, in front of the very people whose whispered judgment had wounded her only moments earlier. "What I have not witnessed," Cashin continued, his voice hardening further, "is any evidence of manipulation, calculation, or unsuitability. What I have witnessed instead tonight is a mother willing to publicly diminish one daughter in favor of promoting another, in front of guests she hoped to impress. I have witnessed sisters who seem more concerned with their own social standing than with basic kindness toward family." Margaret opened her mouth to protest, but Cashin did not allow the interruption. "I have known men and women of considerable wealth and standing throughout my life," he continued. "Very few of them have possessed a fraction of the genuine character I have observed in Miss Hart over these past months. If her own family has spent years unable to recognize that, the failure belongs entirely to them, and not to her." The hall remained silent, guests exchanging uncertain glances. Several noblewomen who had eagerly participated in the evening's whispered speculation now suddenly finding great interest in their wine glasses, unwilling to meet Cashin's steady gaze. Alira felt tears gathering behind her eyes, though this time, unlike so many countless occasions throughout her life, they were not tears of humiliation. She stood a little straighter, feeling something shift inside her chest, a lifetime's accumulated shame beginning slowly to loosen its grip. Cashin turned finally to face her directly, his expression softening considerably as his gaze met hers across the quiet hall. "Miss Hart possesses more genuine worth than most people in this room combined," he said, quieter now, though still clearly audible in the hushed silence. "I would ask that anyone present who has participated in tonight's unkind speculation reconsider, carefully, whether their judgment reflects any actual knowledge of her character, or merely their own discomfort with someone who does not fit the narrow shape they expected." No one spoke. Margaret stood rigid near the center of the room, her carefully constructed evening now thoroughly unraveled, her humiliation complete and entirely public in a way she had clearly never anticipated when she began her careful campaign of whispered cruelty. Wren stared at the floor, her earlier confidence entirely deflated. Delphine had retreated toward the far wall, as though hoping to disappear entirely from a scene she had helped create. Cashin crossed the remaining distance to Alira and offered his arm, a small, deliberate gesture that carried enormous weight given everything that had just unfolded before the assembled guests. "Would you care to continue the evening with me?" he asked quietly, giving her the choice, as he always did, rather than assuming her acceptance. Alira looked at him for a long moment, at the steady, unwavering support in his expression, and felt something settle firmly into place within her, a decision that had been building slowly over months finally crystallizing into certainty. She took his offered arm. "I would like that very much," she said, her voice carrying clearly enough for the surrounding guests to hear, deliberately unashamed for perhaps the first time in her entire life. They walked together back through the hall, past guests who now regarded Alira with an entirely different expression than they had earlier that evening. Curiosity shifted into something closer to genuine respect, or at minimum, careful reconsideration. Margit did not follow. Ren and Delphine remained near the wall, watching their sister walk confidently away from them, supported by a man whose regard for her had just been declared, publicly and unequivocally, in front of everyone who mattered to the reputation Margit had spent a lifetime trying to protect. The gathering resumed its usual rhythm eventually, conversation slowly filling the silence Cashin's words had created, though the undercurrent had shifted entirely. Alira spent the remainder of the evening at Cashin's side, engaging in conversations with guests who now approached her with genuine curiosity rather than careful judgment, several noblewomen expressing sincere interest in her medical knowledge, one elderly gentleman recounting a childhood illness he believed had been misdiagnosed and asking, with evident hope, whether she might offer her opinion. For the first time in her life, Alira occupied a room full of people who saw her, truly saw her, not as the plain daughter overshadowed by her sister's beauty, not as an embarrassment to be managed and minimized, but as a woman of genuine skill and character, worthy of the same respect afforded to anyone else present. It was, she realized later that night, standing alone on the balcony overlooking Ashcombe Hall's moonlit gardens, the first time she had ever truly felt like herself in front of an audience larger than the small circle of villagers who had always known her worth. And it had taken a stranger, a man her own family had once dismissed her chances with entirely, to make that feeling possible. The weeks following the gathering brought changes Alira could not have predicted, ripples spreading outward from that single confrontation in ways that touched nearly every corner of her life. Word of Cashin's public defense traveled quickly through noble circles, and with it, a shift in how she was perceived, no longer the curious village girl staying temporarily at Ashcombe Hall, but a woman whose character had been vouched for unequivocally by one of the region's most respected and famously reserved noblemen. Invitations began arriving with increasing frequency, addressed directly to her rather than routed through Cashin's household as they had been previously. Noblewomen who had once whispered speculation now sought her opinion on herbal remedies for their own ailments. A physician from a neighboring estate wrote, requesting to review her notebook of observations, having heard through mutual acquaintances that her methods had succeeded where more conventional training had failed. Alira navigated this new world with the same careful, steady confidence that had guided her through years of quiet practice in Thornfield, though now, for the first time, that confidence was met with recognition rather than dismissal. She found herself, gradually, unlearning habits built over a lifetime, no longer softening true statements with unnecessary apology, no longer shrinking automatically when she entered a room full of people more polished than herself. Cashin's courtship, when it began in earnest, unfolded with the same careful respect that had characterized their entire relationship from the beginning. He did not rush her, did not press for answers she was not ready to give, but simply continued showing up, consistently and genuinely, in ways both large and small. He remembered the names of villagers she mentioned in passing conversation. He arranged for a proper workspace to be built adjoining the library, one designed specifically to accommodate her growing collection of herbs and remedies. He asked her opinion on estate matters that had nothing to do with medicine, genuinely curious about her perspective on decisions that affected the people living and working on his land. "You consult me as though my opinion matters," she observed one evening, several weeks after the gathering, as they walked together through gardens now touched with the first hints of winter frost. "It does matter," Cashin said simply. "I have found, in the month since I first watched you set a broken leg in the middle of a storm, that your judgment is sound in ways that extend well beyond herbal medicine. I would be foolish not to value that." Meanwhile, word reached her occasionally of her family's circumstances back in Thornfield, carried through the same village gossip channels that had once carried whispers about her own perceived shortcomings. Margaret, humiliated publicly at the gathering, had retreated from social engagements entirely, her reputation among the noble families she had spent years courting significantly diminished by the evening's revelations. Wren's prospects, once considered promising given her natural charm and beauty, had cooled noticeably as word spread of the family's calculated cruelty toward their own daughter. Delphine, similarly affected, found herself facing questions from potential suitors about the character of a family capable of such deliberate unkindness. A letter arrived eventually, weeks later, written in her mother's hand, but carrying a tone entirely different from the warm invitation that had preceded the disastrous gathering. This letter was defensive, filled with excuses and justifications, insisting that Alira had misunderstood the family's intentions, that everything said had been taken entirely out of context, that surely, given everything the family had provided for her throughout her life, she could find it in herself to forgive and reconcile. Alira read the letter twice, sitting alone in the workspace Cashin had built for her, surrounded by the herbs and remedies that had always been her truest comfort. She thought of the shattered teacup that had missed her head by inches. She thought of years spent shrinking herself smaller and smaller to accommodate a family that had never once made room for her as she truly was. She thought of the gathering, of Margaret's calculated cruelty delivered with practiced smiles to an audience of strangers, of Wren's poisonous concern, of Delphine's dismissive laughter. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she brought the letter to Cashin, uncertain what to do with the tangled mixture of guilt and anger it had stirred within her. "What do you want to do?" he asked, reading it carefully before returning it to her hands. "I don't know," she admitted honestly. "Part of me wants to simply cut them away entirely, to never think of that house again. But another part of me remembers moments, however few, when things felt almost normal, almost kind." "You don't owe anyone forgiveness simply because they've asked for it," Cashin said gently. "But you also don't owe anyone permanent anger if you find, eventually, that letting go serves you better than holding on. Whatever you decide, it should be entirely your choice, made on your own terms, not out of guilt or obligation." His words settled something within her, a permission she had perhaps needed to hear from someone whose opinion she genuinely trusted. She eventually wrote back to her mother, a careful, measured letter that neither fully forgave nor entirely condemned, but established clearly and firmly boundaries she intended to maintain going forward. She would visit occasionally, she wrote, when circumstances allowed and when she felt genuinely welcome rather than obligated. She would not tolerate further comparisons to her sisters, further public humiliation, further diminishment of her worth in favor of maintaining appearances. If the family wished to have a relationship with her going forward, it would need to be built on respect rather than the careful hierarchy of favoritism that had defined her childhood. Margaret's response, when it eventually arrived, was subdued, lacking the defensive justifications of her previous letter, though whether this reflected genuine remorse or simple recognition that her daughter now held considerably more social standing than the family that had once dismissed her, Alira could not entirely determine. She decided, ultimately, that the distinction mattered less than the boundaries themselves, which she intended to maintain regardless of her mother's underlying motivations. Wren, surprisingly, reached out separately, her letter carrying a tone Alira had never before encountered from her sister, something that read almost like genuine, if belated, regret. She wrote of watching Alira walk away on Cashin's arm that night at the gathering, of finally understanding, too late, how deeply years of careless cruelty had shaped their relationship, of wishing, however impossible it now seemed, that things might have been different between them from the beginning. Alira did not fully trust the sentiment, not yet, though she found herself willing to leave a small door open, uncertain whether anything genuine might eventually grow through it, but no longer entirely closed to the possibility. As winter settled fully over the region, transforming Ashcombe Hall's gardens into something quiet and still beneath frost and occasional snow, Cashin's courtship deepened into something both of them had, perhaps, known was coming since that first storm-soaked night on the northern road. He proposed to her not with grand ceremony or public spectacle, but quietly, in the library where they had spent so many hours together, surrounded by the very books that had first brought them into each other's lives. "I have spent my entire adult life being courted for my wealth, my title, my standing," he told her, kneeling beside the table where she had catalogued countless volumes over the preceding months. "You have never once cared about any of that. You have simply been yourself, steady and honest and unwilling to shrink for anyone's comfort, and I find that I would rather spend my life beside someone like that than beside anyone impressed merely by circumstance." Alira, who had spent 20 years believing herself unworthy of genuine love, unworthy of being chosen simply and completely for who she was, found herself, for once, entirely without careful, measured words. She simply said yes, her voice steady despite the overwhelming emotion behind it, and allowed herself, finally, fully, to believe that she deserved exactly this. News of the engagement spread through the region faster than any storm ever had, carried from household to household with the particular speed reserved for stories people find genuinely satisfying to tell. The wealthiest, most private nobleman anyone could remember had chosen, deliberately and publicly, a village woman once dismissed by her own family as plain and unremarkable, and the story captured imaginations in a way few noble engagements ever had. Alira found herself, in the months leading up to the wedding, navigating a world that had once felt entirely foreign, but now, gradually, began to feel like something closer to home. She continued her work with the villagers of Thornfield, refusing to abandon the practice that had first shaped her sense of purpose, traveling regularly between Ashcombe Hall and her old village to tend to patients who had known her long before any title attached itself to her name. Cashin never once suggested she give this up, understanding instinctively that her medical work was not simply something she did, but fundamentally part of who she was. Corwin, upon hearing the news of her engagement, greeted her with the same steady warmth he always had, entirely unimpressed by her new circumstances beyond genuine happiness for someone he had watched grow from a quiet, uncertain girl into a woman who had finally claimed the respect she had always deserved. "Told you fear shouldn't decide things for you," he reminded her, pressing her hand warmly. "Glad to see you listened eventually." The wedding itself, held in early spring as the frost finally lifted from Ashcombe Hall's gardens, brought together an unusual mixture of guests. Noble families who had once whispered speculation, now seated alongside villagers from Thornfield, who had traveled considerable distance to witness the occasion. Farmers and fishermen, an elderly widow, who had never expected to find themselves inside such grand surroundings. All gathered to celebrate a woman who had never once made them feel unworthy of her attention or care. Margaret attended, seated carefully toward the back of the gathering, her presence tolerated rather than warmly welcomed, though Alira found, watching her mother's uncertain expression throughout the ceremony, that the old sharp anger had softened into something closer to distant pity. Wren attended as well, her earlier letter of regret apparently genuine enough to warrant a small, cautious reconciliation, the beginnings of a relationship built on considerably more honest footing than anything that had existed between them previously. Delphine did not attend, unable, it seemed, to fully overcome her own resentment, though Alira found she could release even this without the old familiar sting that once accompanied any thought of her sister's disapproval. Standing before the gathered guests, exchanging vows with a man who had seen her clearly from the very first moment they met, in the middle of a storm that neither of them could have predicted would reshape both their lives so completely. Alira felt something settle within her that she had spent 20 years believing she would never fully experience. A sense of belonging that required no shrinking, no apology, no careful softening of herself to fit expectations built by people who had never truly looked at her. In the years that followed, Ashcombe Hall's gardens grew to include an entire section devoted to medicinal herbs, expanded steadily under Alira's careful attention, until physicians from across the region began traveling specifically to consult her knowledge. She established a small school within the estate grounds, teaching village children, regardless of their family's standing, the same careful skills Ivy had once passed down to her, ensuring that knowledge once nearly lost to a single quiet apprenticeship would continue spreading outward for generations to come. Cashin remained, throughout their marriage, exactly the steady, attentive partner he had shown himself to be from their very first conversation on that storm-soaked road, never once treating her expertise as secondary to his own standing, never once suggesting that her worth depended on anything beyond the genuine character she had always possessed, even during the years no one else had bothered to notice it. Alira thought often, in quiet moments tending her expanded gardens or reviewing her ever-growing collection of medical notes, of the frightened, careful girl she had once been, kneeling in a kitchen gathering broken porcelain from the floor while her mother's harsh words echoed around her. That girl, she understood now, had not been lacking anything at all. She had simply been waiting, patiently and without complaint, for someone willing to look closely enough to see what had always been there: steady hands, a sharp mind, and a quiet strength that no amount of careless cruelty had ever truly managed to extinguish. The story of the plain daughter who caught the attention of the region's most reclusive nobleman became, over time, something closer to legend among the villages surrounding Ashcombe Hall, told and retold with the particular satisfaction reserved for stories where genuine character finally receives the recognition it always deserved. But for Alira herself, it was never really a story about beauty overlooked or fortune gained through fortunate circumstance. It was, simply and completely, the story of a woman who had finally been seen, fully and honestly, by someone willing to look past everything her own family had insisted mattered most, and had found in that seeing everything she had ever truly needed.